Hi, I'm Alexandra from Artinis Medical Systems. Today, Rocio and I will be telling you more about the application of fNIRS during the perinatal period. First, a few words about our company. Artinis was born in 2002, more than 20 years ago, and at the time, we were the first company to both develop and distribute NIR devices. Our founders are Dr. Willy Collier, who has more than 30 years of experience in NIRS research and published more than 70 articles, and Roland van den Berg, who is a brilliant engineer. Artinis started as a handful of employees, but we are now 60 plus and we keep growing. We have two key markets, which are neuroscience and sports science, but we also develop some high-quality phantoms, which are required by some EU regulation in some countries like France or Germany. About the speakers today, myself and Rocio. My background is physiotherapy and I have a master in human movement sciences. I have been working at Artinis for 2 years now as an application specialist. Rocio, you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Alexandra. Yes, so I'm Rocio, and I also work as an application specialist at Artinis. I've been working there now for almost a year. Before that, I studied psychology as my bachelor degree, and then I continue with a master's in early childhood research. I also have a background in developmental neuroscience.
So what fun stuff do we have planned for today? Well, first I will introduce you to what fNIRS is, the basics. Then Rocio will dive into some concrete examples on how fNIRS can be applied during the perinatal period. She will also introduce our devices, and unfortunately we cannot finish with a real-life demonstration for this free recording, but if you check out our YouTube channel in the coming month, you will be able to see it there. So, what is fNIRS? To answer what is fNIRS, we actually need to go back in time, approximately 200 years before Artinis. In 1800, Frederick Herschel discovered the existence of light beyond the human visible spectrum. Essentially, he used a glass prism and he separated light in different colors and decided to measure the temperature. What he found out was that temperature increased from violet to red. Building up on that, some 40 years ago, Professor Franz of Duke University made an accidental discovery that turned him into a pioneer of NIRS research. He discovered that it is possible to use near-infrared light to measure oxygen in human tissues. His findings were so promising that they were published in Science, the holy grail of any researcher. Now, you've probably heard me say NIRS a lot, but what exactly is NIRS? NIRS stands for near-infrared spectroscopy. With this technology, we measure changes in light absorption in a volume of tissue. With this, we can calculate the changes in concentration of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin. This tells us about brain or muscle activity. Here you can see the whole light spectrum. As humans, we're actually quite limited. We can only see wavelength between 400 and 700 nanometers, while the whole spectrum goes from the nuclear waves completely to the left to the long radio waves all the way to the right. The near-infrared region, the wavelength we are interested in, is just above our visible spectrum, around 700 to 900 or 1000 nanometers. Why do we use this light? Because of two principles. First, human tissue is relatively transparent to light in the near-infrared region. This is a phenomenon that has been observed as far as the 1600s. If you look at this painting on the left, Joseph the Carpenter by Georges de la Tour, it was made in 1642. And if you look at the hand of the child or baby Jesus that is hiding a candle, you see that some of the light is passing through the hand, that the hand is partly translucent. I'm also pretty sure if you make it a bit more modernized that anybody has put their fingers on the flash of their camera and seen that some of the light goes through their finger. The second principle is the intrinsic absorption of the light by specific chromophores, which we can see in this graph. On the x-axis, you have the near-infrared wavelength from 650 to 1000 nanometer. On the y-axis, you can see the absorption coefficient. We are going to focus on two chromophores in our tissues, we're going to look at oxyhemoglobin in red and deoxyhemoglobin in blue. Why these two chromophores? Because they tell us something about oxygen consumption. For our system, we're using two wavelengths, 760 and 850 nanometers. 760 because we can see that the chromophore deoxyhemoglobin is the main absorber. 850 because we can see that the chromophore oxyhemoglobin is the main absorber. Now, a bit about physics. When you shine light into a tissue, a few things can happen. Part of the light is reflected, some of it is absorbed, some of it is transmitted, and finally some of it is scattered. With near-infrared spectroscopy, what we do is we essentially quantify the amount of incoming light, so the light that is fired by our transmitters, the optodes with the yellow ring, and the amount of outgoing light, the light that is picked up by our receivers, the optode with the blue ring. If we write down as a nice formula, we can quantify the absorbance, which equals the incoming light divided by the outgoing light, and the transmittance or transmission, which is the amount of outgoing light divided by the incoming light. To give you an example, first imagine that we have a fully transparent tissue. In this case, if you shine light onto the tissue, all of it will go through. It will be 100% transmitted because nothing is here to block the light. Now imagine that we have a fully opaque tissue. In this case, if we shine a light on it, the amount of transmission will be zero, since none of the light will be received by the receiving end. It will be 100% absorbed. Fortunately for us, the human tissue is neither completely clear nor completely opaque. Therefore, a certain amount of light is absorbed by the chromophores in our tissue. The formula we've seen before then becomes optical density, aka absorbance, both terms are used interchangeably, which equals the logarithm of the incoming light divided by the outgoing light. This is the first half of the formula that we use for our NIRS device. For the second part of the formula, we use the discovery of two men, Johann Lambert and Auguste Beer. In 1729, Lambert, a French-Swiss mathematician, stated that absorbance depends on length. In other words, the level of absorbance by a tissue is dependent on how much light has to go through. Written as a formula, it gives absorbance equal molecular extension coefficient times length. Nearly a century later, in 1852, Beer, a German physicist, chemist, and mathematician, stated that the absorbance also depends on concentration. As we can see here, we have a higher concentration of chromophores, so more light will be absorbed. This in turn will make the absorbance level rise. Written as a formula, it gives absorbance equal molecular extension coefficient times concentration. When we put all these formulas together, we get the Beer-Lambert law, which states that the absorbance equals the logarithm of the incoming light divided by the outgoing light, which equals the molecular extension coefficient times concentrations times length. In NIRS, we use this formula, but we slightly adapted it, and we call it the modified Lambert-Beer law. How did we modify it? Well, first, we included a delta, so we measure a change. And we included a DPF. DPF stands for differential path length factor. And to understand why it is important, let's look at the picture. Here you can see that you have a transmitter and a receiver per part, and in theory, this nice thin line of light goes from one to the other. But as we saw previously, light scatters, light is absorbed. It's not just a nice thin line, it's actually more of a bulk of light with scattering happening all along the ray. So it's more banana shape, if you will. And to correct for these light losses caused by the scattering, we need to include a DPF, which is a constant factor. For the brain, this is around 6, while for muscle research, it's around 4. This flowchart helps us visualize how we can estimate concentration changes from physical properties. With NIRS, we measure light attenuation, which is a physical property. And after calculation using the modified Lambert-Beer law that we just saw, we can quantify changes in oxyhemoglobin, 850 nanometer, and changes in deoxyhemoglobin, 760 nanometers, which combined give you the total hemoglobin. And while we look at changes in optical density, in practice, we always report on concentration changes. We've discussed a lot of physics. Now, let's have a look at what NIRS can be used for. It has many applications, from muscle research to neuroscience. Other organs can also be investigated, such as the liver, the kidney, the hearts. I have highlighted in this slide a few of the areas that I find particularly interesting, such as hyperscanning, which is measuring multiple subjects at once, for example, a mother and her baby, but also neonatal imaging. For today, we will focus on fNIRS. Now, what is the difference between NIRS and fNIRS? In fNIRS, the F stands for functional. And what it means essentially is that the local changes of oxy and deoxyhemoglobin reflect changes in brain activity. So fNIRS is only about the brain. Let's think of an example. Let's take a finger tapping task. When I do this, I would expect the finger area of my motor cortex to become activated because I'm moving my fingers. But what does it mean in terms of physiological response? The graph that just appeared. This picture shows the hemodynamic response of a finger tapping task. On the x-axis, you have time in second, and on the y-axis, you have concentration changes. The blue line with a little L at the top is the beginning of the task. And what we see is that you have an increase of oxyhemoglobin, and that when the task stops, oxyhemoglobin goes back to baseline. I will explain why. This is the shape that you would expect with brain activation. At first, you will be in a resting state, which gives you the baseline, the zero relative concentration in this graph. Then, starting the task, the brain becomes active. The oxyhemoglobin rises in a span of 5 to 7 seconds, while deoxyhemoglobin decreases or stays similar in the same time frame, so 5 to 7 seconds. Then when you stop the task is shown here as the yellow rectangle, oxyhemoglobin decreases and deoxyhemoglobin increases back to baseline levels, both within 10 to 15 seconds. Why does that happen? One could expect decreased oxygenation because the muscle, for example, consume more oxygen when they're active. For the brain, increased neural activity means increased metabolic demands too. Thankfully, it has developed a very smart mechanistic response called neurovascular coupling. As soon as neural activity increases, more arterial blood is transported to the region. This explains the end of task increase, the yellow rectangle once more. So the cerebral blood flow increases, the blood volume increases, and the outcome is increase of oxyhemoglobin and a slight decrease of deoxyhemoglobin. Now, it is important to mention that this is the standard response in adults, in newborn and infants. Although the majority of studies seem to also show an increase in oxyhemoglobin, sometimes the pattern observed is slightly different. And there is still some discussion about what normal is in children and infants. Now let's take a look at signal components, the signal that we want and the artifacts that we picked up. In the left graph, you can see time on the x-axis and concentration changes on the y-axis. In the right graph, the signal went through a Fourier transformation, and you can see frequency on the x-axis and power on the y-axis. What component do we have in a NIRS signal based on frequency? First, let's start with the hemodynamic signal. This is the signal we are interested in, the one we want to measure with fNIRS. As you can see, it is quite slow. It is shown in black in both graph A and B. Then you have the vasomotion effect, or blood pressure related effect, if you will. This is the spontaneous contractile activity of the veins. And the signal is shown in this frequency, 0.02 Hz, in greens in both graphs. Then you also have the MAIRS wave, or the cyclic changes waves in arterial blood pressure. Sometimes they are at a lower frequency too. Then you have respiration or breathing. It is seen here in blue, and this is what the signal would look like. And finally, you have the heartbeat or cardiac cycle in red. It is the quickest signal that you will measure with fNIRS. So to summarize the physiological artifact, you have the MAIRS wave, the cardiac and respiratory cycle, and blood pressure related effect. But you can also have extrinsic sources of artifacts. The first one to think of is a sensor or head movement. For example, if you headbang or if you bend forward, you will have blood rushing to the head. It might not necessarily be caused by brain activation. You also have to think of environmental light if you measure on a bright sunny day or in a room with a lot of light. And finally, it's important to remember that other optical equipment operating in the near-infrared spectrum can interfere with your near signal. For example, an eye tracker or a motion capturing device. As you can imagine, if you record the prefrontal cortex with an fNIRS device and simultaneously use an eye tracker, which also uses near-infrared light, the receiver optodes of the fNIRS device might pick up some of the light transmitted by the eye tracker. In contrast, you have less chances of this happening if you choose to measure on the occipital lobe. How should your signal look like? During measurement, what should you look for? How do you know if you're measuring oxy or deoxy hemoglobin correctly? You look for a heartbeat. That will tell you if you have a good signal, because oxyhemoglobin comes straight from the heart via the arterioles and the arteries, and so you can and should see a big heartbeat. But in contrast, deoxyhemoglobin is in the veins and venules. It is going back to the heart, so you want to see either a very low heartbeat or no heartbeat at all. Both are normals. Based on what we just saw, would you say this is a good or a bad signal? Well, it is obviously bad. The deoxyhemoglobin in blue should not have such a clear heartbeat. It's probably because the light of the transmitter is directly received and it does not go through the tissue. How to fix it? Place the optodes perpendicular to the skin. This one shows large peaks at the same time in oxyhemoglobin in red, in deoxyhemoglobin in blue, and in total hemoglobin in green. This could be due to relative movement of the device on the skin, and an easy way to fix that is to tighten the head cap to minimize movement. Side note, it is possible to filter out the higher frequency. This is obviously a very noisy signal. The transmitted light is completely absorbed by the tissue, so no light is received by the receiver. And that's probably because you have some hair underneath the optode. So an easy way to fix that is to click out the optode, to part the hairs underneath, and to click the optode back in. And this is textbook optimal signal. You have a beautiful clear heartbeat in the oxy and total hemoglobin, and minimal to no heartbeat in the deoxyhemoglobin in blue. Finally, let us take a look at how fNIRS compares to other modalities. On this graph, you can see spatial resolution on the x-axis, temporal resolution on the y-axis, and degree of mobility on the z-axis. I won't discuss all the other modalities because it would take too much time, but I would like to talk about EEG and fMRI, which are the most used modalities. Let's first compare fNIRS to EEG. EEG is based on electrical activity of neurons. So as you can see in this graph, the temporal resolution, the time it takes for you to get a clear image, is higher than fNIRS, simply because, well, electrical activity is much faster than the hemodynamic response, which takes a few seconds to show. However, EEG has a much lower spatial resolution than NIRS, and it is also more sensitive to motion and muscle artifacts. It also has a lower signal-to-noise ratio. Then let's compare fNIRS to fMRI. As you can see, the spatial resolution, the quality of the image obtained with fMRI is higher than with fNIRS. Actually, fMRI and fNIRS are based on the same hemodynamic response. It's been measured differently. So this is why it gives them different properties. Another advantage of fMRI is that you can measure deep brain structure, while the fNIRS can only measure the neocortex. But a big advantage of fNIRS is that there is no movement restriction. You can walk with it, you can talk with it, you can dance with it. It is portable, you can measure wirelessly. It is also a lot cheaper and easier to use than fMRI. So it is a great alternative if you want to minimize your budget and measure superficial parts of the brain. To summarize the benefit of fNIRS, it is non-invasive, wearable, and wireless. It can cover many different fields of application, and it is quite easy to use and compatible with other modalities such as EEG, for example. But there are also some things to take into consideration. You have to keep in mind the hemodynamic delay. So when you develop your study design, think that it does take a few seconds for this response to build up, and that in order to have a nice signal, you need to be a bit patient. Think also that the hemodynamic response adds up. So if you have repeated stimuli that follow up each other quickly, you will not be able to distinguish between different stimuli. You also cannot measure deeper structures, only the neocortex as we just saw, and important to remember that these are always relative measures, so you always need a baseline. It's not absolute values. Since you measure concentration changes, you also need to measure this brain area in a resting state. That was it for my part. Now Rocio will give you some concrete example and very interesting articles published in fNIRS during the perinatal period.
So now that you got some basic understanding of fNIRS as a technique, let's have a look at some studies that can serve as a good example of how to use fNIRS during the perinatal period. So the exact duration of the perinatal period seems to vary depending on the definition, but today we will follow the one given by the ICD-10, according to which this period starts at 22 completed weeks of gestation and ends 1 week after birth. And well, I will only briefly talk about each study and their findings, and of course I advise that if you are interested in a particular topic or publication, that you read the full article, because the intention here today is only to give you an idea of the kind of research that can be performed in this age period and with our fNIR devices or similar ones. And of course, besides this first week of life, there are many more examples and studies in infants, in toddlers, in older children, of course also in adults, but that's not the focus today. So if you're interested in a population older than the ones covered here, please feel free to contact us. All right, so let's dive in. One of the applications of fNIRS that seems to be quite popular during this period is studying the cortical response of neonates to olfactory stimuli. And here I have two examples. So on the left, we have a study by Free and colleagues, and they investigated whether full-term and also preterm neonates will exhibit an activation on the olfactory processing areas when they were presented with a cloth with the scent of their mom's breast, in contrast to a freshly washed cloth. And they observed an activation in response to even a low concentration of the maternal scent on babies that were born from 32 weeks. They also argued that these findings are relevant for attachment and bonding, since maternal scent helps to facilitate these processes. Then on the right, we have a similar study, this time measuring bilaterally on the orbitofrontal cortex. This study comes from Ayoma and colleagues, And what they investigated are the difference in activation when the babies were exposed to the odors of maternal breast milk in contrast to formula milk. And they observed that maternal milk triggered a bigger activation, indicated by a higher increase in oxyhemoglobin than formula milk did. Next, still on the topic of olfactory stimuli, but now investigating whether they may cause discomfort or pain to preterm or full-term newborns. We have another two studies, and the one above is again by Free and colleagues, but now they're investigating whether odors that are released by healthcare products, for example, pure hand cleaner, which has a very strong scent, could cause irritation of the nasal mucosa and therefore induce pain, like they do in adults. And they also investigated if oral glucose could mitigate this pain. So they recorded on the olfactory, in the frontal, and the somatosensory cortices, and also analyzed pain behaviors from videotape recordings. And the participants showed activation in the olfactory and the nociceptive processing areas beginning at 31 weeks postmenstrual age, and they also exhibited pain behaviors as seen in the videos. And pain scores were actually positively correlated with the level of cortical activation. They also could find that the oral glucose inhibited both the pain behaviors and the cortical activation. Then in contrast, on the study below, what Yoon and colleague wanted to investigate is whether fNIRS can be used as a reliable measure of pain on a cortical level. So rather than relying, like in the study above, on physiological pain scales or behavioral scales, they wanted to see if they can measure this on a cortical level and then use fNIRS as a complementary measure to those scales. So they recorded on the prefrontal cortex of neonates that were undergoing circumcision and then correlated the results with the results from the neonatal infant pain scale. And they saw changes in fNIRS that differed between different types of painful stimuli that were applied during the procedure, and this was not the case for the neonatal infant pain scale. So they suggest that indeed fNIRS may complement scales of this kind to assess the quality of pain. Now, besides smell, the development of other senses has also been investigated using fNIRS. Particularly here, we have examples for vision and for touch. So in the case of vision, in the study above, Karen and colleagues were the first to determine that changes in cerebral oxygenation occur in response to a stimulation in the visual cortex in newborns. So they measured this during spontaneous sleep during the first days of life, and they observed a similar response to what is expected in adults, namely that when they were stimulating the visual cortex, there was an increase in this area in oxyhemoglobin, and there was a decrease in deoxyhemoglobin, and also an increase in total hemoglobin. So this suggests that there is an increase in cerebral blood flow that is overcompensating for the increased oxygen consumption in the visual cortex, which is more activated in this case. Now, for the study below, which concerns the sense of touch, we have Cashew and colleagues investigating the response to several touch stimuli. So they investigated the response to audiomotor stimuli, in this case it was a pacifier, the response to palmar stimuli, so tapping on the hand, and the response to plantar stimuli, so tapping on the feet. And all these somatic stimuli exhibited different cortical responses on the frontopaterial cortex, and the higher response came from the oromotor somatic stimulus, so from the pacifier. Now, another research field where fNIRS is widely used is that one of language development. Here I have two examples, again occurring during the perinatal period. The one on the left is a study by Vanasin and colleagues, and what they investigated is whether native and non-native languages will recruit different neural networks at birth. So they compared temporal areas over both the right and left hemisphere, and they found actually that there is a dominance of the left hemisphere when it comes to the native language, and the opposite for the non-native language. So this will be dominated by an activation in the right hemisphere. and non-linguistic stimuli triggered bilateral similar activation. Then on the right, we have another example, this time by Varela and Gervain, who studied whether newborns can already track word order, so whether from birth we already have this ability. And they found that indeed they were able to notice a discrepancy in the order of words that were presented in different word sequences, and this was indicated by a dishabituation effect. Now, as mentioned before, the perinatal period, as we are understanding it here, will go from 22 completed weeks of gestation until the end of the first week of life. And therefore, this means that it will also be relevant to measure the baby when it is still in the womb. However, to our knowledge, using fNIRS to measure human fetuses still has to be tried. Nonetheless, it may be worth mentioning that a proof of concept with an animal model has already been deemed feasible and relevant by McNabb and colleagues. They use a pregnant sheep and they use our Portamon device. So if you're up for the challenge, please feel free. And additionally, it may be worth mentioning that fNIRS can of course be used to measure newborns, but also can be used during the perinatal period to measure the brain and the muscle dynamics of the pregnant mother, and therefore assess whether pregnancy and or the postpartum period can affect these processes. So these were all the studies that I had for you, but you can find many more publications in our website, and you can also filter there by application or by device. Moving on, let's now dive in our NIRS devices. As my colleague Alexandra has mentioned previously, NIRS is a technique that can be used to assess both muscle and brain activity. However, here we are going to focus only on those devices that can be used to measure brain activity, and then during the perinatal period, which is the period that concerns us right now. Let's first talk about our baby bride. So what is the baby bride? Well, obviously it is a fNIRS device, and this means that you can use it to measure brain oxygenation. In particular, what you measure is relative concentration changes of oxy and deoxy hemoglobin, and also total hemoglobin. The baby bride comes with 10 transmitters and 8 receivers, and this allows for up to 27 channels. And these channels can be placed anywhere on the head in different configurations or templates. The sampling rate is up to 27 Hz, and you can measure data online. That will be via Bluetooth in our software OxySoft, but also offline. And if you decide to do it offline, you can record for more than 100 hours, and then the data will be automatically backed up. The battery also lasts for quite some time. It's up to 3 full hours, and it can also be extended very easily by connecting a power bank to the device. Another very interesting feature of the baby bride is the multi-power gain control. What this means is that there is an algorithm within the device that will adjust the light intensity according to the skin type and the amount of hair. It also comes with an integrated movement sensor, or IMU, and this helps to account for the movement. So actually, everything that I have mentioned so far is also applicable for our normal bride. That's the device that you can see on this slide. This device is recommended from 2 years of age. But then, what are the differences and the actual features that will make the baby bride so perfect for babies, and why do we recommend that over this other device when it comes to developmental studies in, for example, newborns? Let me then walk you over the features of the baby bride that make it a perfect device for babies. First of all, comfortability has been prioritized in the design. The optodes are, in contrast to the optodes of the normal bride, they are flat, and they are also made of a rubber material, which is very soft and therefore very gentle on the scalp. The optodes as well, they work with a clicking system. This makes it very easy and quick to attach and detach from the head cap. This makes also that the setup time of the device is very short. The cables between the optodes bunches and the control unit are purposely made longer, allowing for more flexibility in the setup. So this means that you can place the control unit somewhere else next to the baby or farther away from reach. but also that you can mount it, let's say on the caregiver, on the arm, as you can see in the picture, or on the chest by using a band. Another important thing to mention is that all materials are fully biocompatible and therefore safe for use at these ages. And although this is also true for the normal bride, the baby bride is very lightweight. It is a total of 300 grams, including the battery and the head cap. So therefore, it is completely portable and very comfortable to use. Another feature that is definitely worth mentioning is that you can very easily combine multiple devices. So this means that you can use one baby bride and one bride together and at the same time, or two baby brides or two normal brides. And the data will be automatically synchronized in our software in Oxysoft. So this allows very easily for hyperscanning setup and studies like the ones you see in the picture. So measuring multiple babies at the same time, measuring the baby and the caregiver at the same time. Finally, another characteristic of the bride that is worth mentioning is that you can combine two brides in the same head cap, so two normal brides or two baby brides. And again, the data will be automatically synchronized in Oxysoft. This is ideal when you want to achieve more brain coverage, because you think, well, 27 channels are not enough for my study. Then you can achieve up to 54 channels. This is actually not very common or not very helpful or frequent in studies with babies, since due to their smaller head, well, there is limited space and therefore 27 channels already covered a lot. But who knows, it might be relevant for your particular research goals. Another device that I wanted to introduce to you is the Portalite Mini. This is ideal when you want to measure only prefrontally or on areas that have little to no hair and then with less channels. The device that you see now here in the picture is the older device, so we are working on releasing a new generation that then will be called the Portalite Mini NK2. We already have this for adults, and you can see that on the next slide. So basically, then you will have two detachable sensors, and each sensor will come with 6 channels that are relative, and 3 of them will be long channels or normal channels, and 3 of them will also be short channels. So as I said before, where distance between the transmitter and the receiver is shorter and therefore measuring in more superficial layers. Then you also will have an absolute channel measuring the TSI. This is the tissue saturation index, and this is giving you the absolute percentage of oxyhemoglobin in the tissue. What is perhaps then also important to mention here is that the Portalite will be designed to measure also muscle tissue, in case that is what your research goals entail. So as I just mentioned, you can see here the adult Portalite NK2, and as you see in the picture, because it comes with 2 sensors, you can place one sensor in the prefrontal cortex to measure on brain, and then you can also place the other sensor on a particular muscle of your interest. Of course, you can also place both sensors on the prefrontal cortex for more channels on this area.
As previously said, the re-recording of this workshop will not include a demonstration of the baby brides, but if you're curious and want to see more about it, check out our YouTube channel in the coming month. You will be able to see it there.
Alright, so that was all we had for you today. If you have any questions, please feel free to send an email to askforinfo@artinis.com, and we will be very happy to answer to you. And we hope this was helpful. If you like, you can also reach us via our social media, which is in the next slide.
And if you want to learn more about fNIRS and the developing brain, watch our YouTube webinar on how to use fNIRS in child research. Have a great day.
See you soon.